At exactly 8:15 a.m., an entire city was turned into fire. For decades, official accounts emphasized strategy and victory. What they left out were the decades of consequences carried in silence. Survivors navigating stigma, scientists tracing health effects, and families confronting questions about inheritance and recovery. Long-term studies raised uncertainties about illness and reproduction that remain part of the record today. In this film, we follow those untold dimensions. Updated survivor numbers in 2025, suppressed documents now unsealed, the overlooked presence of non-Japanese victims, and the nuclear dangers that still surround our world. To understand this legacy, we return to the weapon that first made it possible, the bomb that redefined war. In the middle of the Second World War, when firepower was still measured in steel shells and streams of bullets, an entirely different kind of weapon was being assembled in guarded laboratories across the United States. Designed in secrecy and hidden behind vast budgets, this device was small enough to fit inside a bomber aircraft, yet calculated to release energy equal to thousands of tons of TNT. Years of research collapsed into a single, compact cylinder of uranium, built to travel across oceans and alter history in a single strike. Even the crew chosen to deliver it trained without understanding the full magnitude, while the designers knew precisely the altitude for detonation. On August 6, 1945, at 580 meters over Hiroshima, that calculation was realized. The yield has since been estimated at roughly 16 kilotons, an amount that, in one instant, redefined modern warfare. At the time, Hiroshima was a city of about 340,000 to 350,000 people. Its markets and trams throbbed with ordinary life. Commuters on their way to work, families preparing breakfast, children filing into schools scattered through its neighborhoods. Yet the city was also embedded into Japan's military system. It hosted logistical headquarters, garrisons numbering in the tens of thousands, warehouses full of rations, and vital transport links by rail and harbor. Civilian life and military infrastructure existed side by side, blurring any clear distinction between battlefield and home front. When target lists were drawn up, Hiroshima's mixed character played directly into its selection. Cities already damaged by conventional bombing were removed because they would not show clearly what this new weapon could do. Hiroshima's largely intact urban grid, its significant military presence, and the absence of prisoner-of-war camps meant it could serve both strategic and demonstrative purposes. Military leaders believed the strike might hasten surrender, but they were also aware that the city's condition made it possible to observe the weapon's effect on a major population center without interference from prior destruction. In this sense, Hiroshima was chosen both for its role within Japan's war effort and because it provided an unwanted opportunity to measure what an atomic bomb would mean for the future of war. At precisely 8:15 that morning, the bomb detonated high over the city center. A blinding white flash lit the sky, followed almost instantly by a crushing blast wave and a spreading firestorm. In less than 1 second, the city was transformed. Structures collapsed, flames engulfed entire districts, and lives were severed in mid-motion. People on their way to school or at their morning routines became victims of forces no one had ever experienced before. That moment signaled more than destruction. It opened a nuclear era where the survival of entire cities, or even nations, could be decided in seconds. The immediate objective was accomplished. Hiroshima's military facilities ceased to operate, and so did much of the urban life surrounding them. But the deeper consequence went beyond ending a war. The attack revealed that humanity now had the capacity to erase entire populations in a single event. August 6th became less a tactical date than a turning point, one where human beings crossed into a condition where self-annihilation was possible. Ever since, the bombing has been debated as both strategy and warning, symboli of victory to some and of irretrievable loss to others. The city itself was left in ruins that testified to both realities. What had been homes, shrines, classrooms, and barracks became open wasteland, marked by scorched foundations and outlines burned into stone. For those who survived, the morning became inseparable from trauma. A bright summer day that in 1 second revealed the fragility of human life in the atomic age. The catastrophe did not remain confined to that square of Japan, but carried a lesson visible across the world. War was no longer limited to conventional limits. It had expanded into a domain where devastation could be sudden and nearly absolute. Even now, 80 years later, the resonance of that day persists. The suffering did not fade when the fires were extinguished, or when Japan accepted surrender. Survivors battled burns and radiation sickness in the days and weeks that followed. Governments and militaries built policies around a world where nuclear arms defined power. Scientific institutes spent decades documenting health outcomes, while families inheriting the survivors' memories struggled against questions about their own futures. The impact extended into international treaties, into Cold War rivalries, and into movements that insisted the event should never be permitted to recur. Hiroshima remains central not as a frozen photograph of ruins, but as the introduction of a timeline that still evolves. Each decade has uncovered new dimensions, newly released records, newly refined casualty analyses, and the persistent testimony of those who lived through the blast continually reshape how the story is understood. What began in warfare translates now into data, museum displays, and renewed debates over nuclear weapons. Hiroshima's meaning grows rather than recedes, changing as memory and history interact. The devastation cannot be measured solely by numbers of buildings or estimates of lives lost. Its most enduring consequence has been the continuing ripple across generations and nations. With each new year, the memory intersects with new voices. Researchers publishing data on radiation, activists calling for disarmament, young audiences confronting material their grandparents often avoided. The strike in 1945 set a trajectory that 2025 continues. And the weapon's legacy is not only about steel, flames, or treaties. The people who walked away from the blast, burned and displaced, became the living reminders of what modern war had made possible. Long after the mushroom cloud dispersed, their presence forced the world to face the aftermath, not only in rubble, but in bodies, testimony, and silence pushed aside. It is within their lives that the meaning of Hiroshima was carried forward, what it meant for human beings to survive what had seemed unsurvivable. The hidden survivors. They were called Hibakusha. The word literally means explosion-affected people, but over time it became more than a neutral label. It marked out those who had lived through the atomic blast, those whose bodies bore scars, and whose families carried its imprint. In the chaotic aftermath of the bombing, they were counted among the masses of the injured. As the years passed, however, their place in Japanese society became more complicated. Survival marked not closure, but a lifelong identity that could not be put aside. Today, in 2025, that identity remains, but with diminishing witnesses. According to the Ministry of Health, there are 99,130 officially registered Hibakusha, with an average age of 86.13. Their numbers continue to fall each year, a stark shift from the peak in 1981, when 372,264 people were recognized under the system of official Hibakusha certificates, first introduced in 1957. What was once a broad community of different ages has now become almost entirely elderly. Each August ceremony in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is marked not only by remembrance of the dead, but also by awareness that the living voices of survivors are finite. The challenges they faced in everyday life went far beyond the physical wounds of 1945. Archival records and oral histories document how Hibakusha encountered discrimination throughout post-war Japan. Employers sometimes refused to hire them, fearing illness or shortened lifespans. Prospective in-laws hesitated to accept marriage to a survivor, worried about birth defects or reproductive problems. Hospitals and community institutions could treat them differently, out of misplaced fear of contamination. These attitudes combined to form a powerful stigma that pressed many Hibakusha into silence. Families often concealed their survivor status, not only from neighbors, but even from their own children. The strategy of concealment protected against prejudice, but it came at the cost of isolation and unspoken suffering. That silence allowed official narratives to dominate for decades. The story of Hiroshima in the early post-war period circulated largely through government statements or international debate, not personal testimony. Survivors carried burns, weakness, or recurring illness that sometimes took decades to appear, but the private burden was invisible in public accounts. What distinguished their pain was not always what strangers could see. Sometimes it was the uncertainty of when sickness might return, or how others would perceive them if their identity became known. Importantly, Hibakusha were not all Japanese nationals. When the bomb fell, Hiroshima held a population drawn from across East Asia and beyond. Estimates vary, but research shows that Koreans constituted a significant portion of those killed or injured. Some studies suggest that roughly 1 in 5 of the immediate victims was Korean. Most had been brought as forced laborers, compelled to work in construction sites or weapons factories under colonial rule. After surviving the explosion, they faced further marginalization, left out of Japan's welfare system, and denied full access to survivor benefits for decades. Many descendants of Korean Hibakusha continue to seek acknowledgement and compensation for that layered injustice. Chinese prisoners of war were also in the city at the time of the bombing, their names rarely appearing in records for many years. Allied prisoners captured in battles across Southeast Asia were among the casualties as well. These groups sat uneasily within the prevailing story of Hiroshima, which tended to frame the tragedy in terms of Japanese civilians alone. The presence of these overlooked victims raised difficult questions about responsibility and recognition. Only later did their accounts gain space in scholarship and public exhibitions, showing that the circle of suffering extended across multiple nationalities. For many who were children or teenagers at the time, the meaning of survival unfolded slowly. Testimonies describe a boy walking to primary school, a girl assigned to a labor detail, or infants cradled in the arms of parents who did not survive. Illnesses surfaced over time, sometimes appearing in adulthood. Survivors who tried to form families feared fertility issues, miscarriages, or abnormal births. The bomb shaped their personal timelines for decades, not just in that one morning. Childhood memories became adult questions, carried across an entire lifetime. As more survivors aged into their later years, silence gave way to witness. What once seemed unbearable to speak of gradually became too important to withhold. Survivors began to tell their stories in schools, publish memoirs, appear in films, and testify before international conferences. Museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki built permanent repositories to record their voices. The Japanese government itself, through the Ministry of Health and related programs, has collected thousands of testimonies, an effort to preserve them for future generations before they fall silent forever. In this way, the erosion of living memory is balanced against recorded testimony, ensuring that what is lost in numbers is not lost in truth. Hibakusha testimony reshaped remembrance. What was once stigmatized became honored. The survivor identity that had burdened careers and families grew into a moral force driving peace advocacy. Their accounts made visible the lived experience behind casualty statistics or archival reports. They reminded younger audiences that destruction was not an abstract total, but a series of personal losses, told in the voices of those who remembered both the blaze and the long recovery afterward. Other neglected accounts, Korean survivors, Chinese prisoners, Allied captives, gradually resurfaced beside them, widening the scope of memory to a story shared internationally. Hiroshima was not only Japan's tragedy, but part of a global history that drew in diverse communities. The recognition of these groups has shifted public understanding of nuclear war from something bounded by national borders to a catastrophe that cut across backgrounds and circumstances. Such recognition was long delayed, but in the context of modern commemoration, it adds depth to what peace remembrance means. By the mid-2020s, the Hibakusha generation has become almost entirely elderly, their time visibly limited. But their testimony has shaped culture, politics, and education. Where once they struggled against stigma, now they occupy a central place in Japan's remembrance traditions and international disarmament advocacy. Their words are preserved in archives, their faces appear on museum screens, and their memories continue to warn of what nuclear conflict brings. Even as their numbers diminish, what they gave the world persists. Their stories point to consequences that could not be measured in 1945. Survival meant years of hidden illness, generational questions, and voices long kept at the margins. All of this complicates how one understands the scale of Hiroshima. To grasp the cost fully, one must look beyond identity and testimony to the problem of numbers themselves, the effort to determine how many were lost, and how many more continued to suffer afterward. Numbers that still change. When the bomb exploded above Hiroshima, people on the ground could not begin to measure the scale of loss. Tens of thousands were gone almost instantly, yet the chaos of fire and destruction left no way to capture a complete count. In the days that followed, officials, journalists, and researchers produced rough estimates, but those numbers varied by astonishing margins, often diverging by more than 100,000 lives. From the start, statistics became shaped by circumstance. Early U.S. accounts emphasized that the strike had been decisive. Japanese authorities, under occupation, operated within limits that prevented full investigation or publication. For decades, the numbers the world heard were shaped as much by classification and wartime constraint as by evidence. For years, figures of around 70,000 dead on the day circulated widely. Such numbers appeared in textbooks and reports and became fixed in public memory. Yet survivors and researchers knew entire districts had simply ceased to exist, leaving no one to report losses. Families with no surviving members vanished from the official tally. Thousands who fled the city died later on roadsides and rural shelters, undocumented. From the beginning, the statistics lacked the capacity to capture lives erased without record, leaving behind a public number far lower than reality. By the 1950s and 60s, as fragments of Japanese hospital records and demographic studies resurfaced, unanswered questions grew. But because occupation authorities had seized large volumes of early surveys, medical logs, and government registers, researchers were left with incomplete data for decades. Only in later years, with records returned and digitized, could historians begin to piece together a more accurate count. By applying demographic reconstruction, cross-checking census results, family records, registry books, cremation logs, and archived medical files, new estimates emerged that portrayed Hiroshima's devastation far more starkly than initial reports. Today, the most widely accepted range, endorsed by institutions like the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, places the total deaths in Hiroshima by the end of 1945 between 90,000 and 166,000. The lower end of this spectrum represents immediate fatalities, while the higher end accounts for those who died in the weeks and months after from burns, infections, and acute effects of radiation. This range explains why a single fixed figure, such as 140,000, is not sufficient. It masks both the uncertainty of record keeping and the varied ways people succumbed in the aftermath. Historians emphasize that the point is not precision down to one number, but a recognition of the scope of death that was far larger than early reports admitted. The devastation did not stop when the year ended. Many survivors who appeared to escape the flash only later developed fatal complications. Radiation sickness took its course as people collapsed with vomiting, bleeding, and fever days after exposure. Weak immune systems left others vulnerable to tuberculosis, pneumonia, and infections that lasted for years. For those with severe burns, death followed weeks later as wounds deteriorated without effective medical treatment. Each of these unfolding tragedies added to the toll far beyond the scope of instantaneous deaths and revealed that the true human cost had to be understood as a continuum stretching long after August 6th. When researchers in the 1950s began tracking survivors, long-term trends became clear. Children who had survived suffered dramatically higher rates of leukemia by the early 1950s, often dying years after the bombing. In following decades, adults exposed to the blast showed elevated cases of solid cancers, particularly thyroid, lung, and stomach cancers. Studies showed these increases were directly tied to radiation exposure, extending the shadow of Hiroshima well beyond 1945. Modern casualty assessments now include such delayed deaths as part of the bomb's toll, reminding us that casualty numbers cannot be limited to a snapshot at the end of 1 year. Recent decades of technology changed how these estimates are refined. Historians now reconstruct missing populations by cross-checking diverse pieces of evidence. Census projections show how many people should have been present in Hiroshima in August 1945. Registry books and cremation logs provide names and numbers, even when partly destroyed, and can be digitized for comparison. Medical records describe waves of deaths months later. By layering these fragments together, historians can fill gaps left by vanished records. In this way, modern methods create a clearer picture of the city's demographic collapse, even when entire families left no direct trace. This fuller picture still carries uncertainty. Many were reduced to ash or vanished without remains. Families ended entirely, so no relative ever came forward to report the missing. Some who succumbed to illness years later were never officially attributed to the bomb. For this reason, historians speak in ranges rather than final figures, acknowledging what can be known while leaving space for the losses hidden forever. Far from undermining history, this openness to uncertainty reflects the rigor of modern research. What earlier generations reduced to rounded numbers is now presented as a range representing the scale of absence. Recognizing the revised numbers reshapes how Hiroshima is remembered worldwide. Early official narratives could present the attack as a rapid, decisive strike in a time of war. But the expanded figures, reaching far beyond first day, reports complicate those claims. A city of around 340,000 reduced by up to half its population challenges the idea of a neat strategic calculation. As casualty ranges climb into six figures, they press harder on debates about justification and morality. Statistics originally stripped down to abstractions now re-emerge as traces of human beings and entire communities erased. Each refinement matters because behind every number rests a person, a family structure, and the ripple effects of that absence. Adjusting the death toll is not only about historical accuracy, it is about acknowledging countless lives that were once invisible in the official record. The secrecy that limited disclosure in the immediate aftermath has given way to decades of careful archival work, cross-checking, and testimony. In the process, the scope of Hiroshima's tragedy has widened, demanding that global memory take into account those lost figures alongside the visible ruins. Which brings us to a deeper question. Why labor so carefully over statistics from 80 years ago? Because how we count affects how we understand what was suffered and how we weigh its meaning in history. The numbers are not static memorials. They are reminders that devastation was larger, slower, and longer lasting than early reports acknowledged. And that acknowledgement points directly to the next part of the story: what continued to kill long after the fires went out. Radiation without end. The firestorm in Hiroshima burned itself out within hours, but something less visible lingered. Radiation released by the detonation scattered through debris, smoke, and dust that settled into air, soil, and water. Unlike flames or collapsing buildings, it carried no warning signs. It entered quietly, through breath, food, and skin, taking root in blood and bone. For survivors who lived through the first days, this became the threat that endured. Physicians, overwhelmed with injuries, had no experience treating radiation exposure. What they saw unfolding in clinics and shelters defied comparison with any known illness. Within days, a pattern of acute radiation sickness emerged. People who had looked unharmed began fainting, vomiting, or bleeding uncontrollably. Chunks of hair dropped from scalps. Fevers surged, wounds refused to heal, and infections spread unchecked. Even small cuts became lethal when bone marrow no longer produced white blood cells. Doctors watched patients decline suddenly, with little ability to intervene. The best they could offer was comfort, for there were no effective treatments in 1945. Accounts from surviving medical staff described the helplessness of watching healthy-looking people collapse, often within hours. Behind it all was the same mechanism: radiation damaging bone marrow, suppressing cell production, and blocking the body's ability to defend itself. Hospitals, stripped of staff and supplies by the blast, buckled under the burden. Many medical workers were themselves injured or dying, leaving wards filled with patients whose conditions baffled remaining staff. To survivors, the randomness was unbearable. Neighbors untouched by burns would perish from strange fevers, while others who had been badly injured seemed to endure longer. These visible effects etched radiation into memory as an invisible, arbitrary killer. As years passed, doctors noticed a second wave of consequences. By the early 1950s, researchers began documenting a surge in leukemia, especially among children who had been close to the hypocenter. Families who had believed they escaped the worst suddenly lost young sons and daughters years later. This link between radiation exposure and blood cancers was one of the earliest long-term patterns confirmed in Hiroshima. Studies charted cancer rates by distance from explosion, confirming that exposure levels determined future illness. The damage radiation had imprinted onto bone marrow did not fade. It returned later, reshaping life expectancy years beyond the explosion. By the 1970s, longer-term health studies uncovered further consequences. While leukemia cases eventually declined from their mid-century peak, solid cancers, stomach, breast, lung, thyroid, rose steadily among adult survivors. The latency misled many at first. Decades after the attack, survivors thought they had grown beyond danger. Instead, illnesses surfaced late in life, proving that exposure left enduring risks that could emerge decades later. According to the Radiation Effects Research Foundation's lifespan study, radiation exposure is linked to hundreds of excess leukemia deaths and roughly 1,700 excess solid cancer deaths between 1950 and 2000 in survivor groups. These are not speculative numbers. They are documented through one of the most extensive medical studies in history, showing radiation as a lifelong danger. The effort to track these outcomes became global science. After occupation authorities tightly controlled records in the early years, research shifted to permanent institutions like the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, later renamed the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, RERF. For decades, these bodies conducted annual exams, interviewed survivors, and followed their health across generations. Their work set the basis for modern radiation safety standards, shaping how medical imaging, nuclear energy, and occupational radiation limits are regulated worldwide. For Hibakusha, however, participation meant constant reminders of their exposure, annual evidence that their health carried an invisible question mark. Their lives became intertwined with medical charts and statistics, where each new illness was evaluated in the shadow of August 6th. Fears did not stop at personal health. From the beginning, survivors worried about passing hidden damage to their children. Families questioned whether marriage into survivor households might produce birth defects. Stigma attached itself to Hibakusha women most of all, as communities worried about reproductive health. The mixture of social prejudice and scientific uncertainty left many Hibakusha isolated, avoided not because of visible scars, but because of imagined risks. Long-term studies brought clearer answers. Researchers tracked thousands of children conceived after the bomb, comparing them to unexposed families. Results consistently showed no statistically significant increase in congenital malformations among these later conceived children. This evidence reassured families against the fears of widespread inherited deformities. However, research also confirmed a crucial distinction. Children exposed in utero, particularly during weeks 8 to 15 of gestation, faced profound risks. High-dose exposure at this developmental stage often caused microcephaly and intellectual disabilities, conditions observed in children born to mothers who had been near ground zero during pregnancy. In this way, radiation's danger proved both time-dependent and dose-related, devastating those caught in the most vulnerable stages of life. The contrast between these findings shaped the legacy of radiation's biological reach. Later conceived children did not inherit massive mutations, disproving the most extreme predictions that haunted the post-war years. Yet those who were exposed in the womb bore lifelong consequences, a population visibly marked by neurodevelopmental harm. Survivors' anxieties about heredity never disappeared entirely, but the scientific record today makes clear. Large-scale inherited deformities across generations are not supported by the data. By the 21st century, advances in molecular science allowed closer inspection of survivor health. Researchers documented subtle biological effects, such as changes in immune response and a continuing rise in certain age-related illnesses. These were real, measurable health burdens, but they never matched the catastrophic visions once predicted. The findings are sobering not because they confirm monstrous inherited effects, but because they demonstrate radiation as a chronic risk inscribed into bodies over lifetimes. Radiation did not vanish when the fires burned out. It shaped decades of illness, statistical excess deaths, and constant uncertainty for tens of thousands. For survivors, this science was not abstract. It shaped how communities understood themselves, how marriage proposals were rejected, and how annual checkups became emotional trials. Testimony often blends physical and psychological weight. Survivors describe living always under suspicion, wondering if illness years later was just bad luck or the return of a force they encountered in childhood. The statistics make global safety standards possible, but for the Hibakusha, those numbers describe their own children, friends, or spouses lost to late illnesses. 80 years later, the lessons remain critical. The fires of Hiroshima defined the day, but radiation defined the decades that followed. Its effects spread beyond what could be tallied in rubble counts or initial death tolls. Every cancer case, every child born with in utero effects, every survivor revisiting hospitals in old age stands as evidence that the atomic bomb's destruction extended long past August 1945. Radiation became the element that reached furthest into the future, silent, gradual, and enduring. The scientific record does not support fears of widespread inherited deformities, but it does confirm measurable long-term health consequences, from acute radiation sickness to elevated cancer rates and in utero damage in pregnancies at risk. This is the dimension of Hiroshima, often invisible in photographs of ruins, yet central to understanding the full cost. And as one looks beyond the medical charts and studies, another question arises. Who were the people included in these numbers, and whose suffering was left out of official recognition? The lost victims, Koreans and outsiders. When people picture Hiroshima on that August morning, they usually imagine Japanese civilians, soldiers at the garrisons, and children walking to school. What is less often remembered is that tens of thousands of Koreans were also in the city when the bomb fell. Scholars and reports indicate that Koreans, mobilized under Japan's colonial rule, formed a significant portion of Hiroshima's wartime population. Forced into labor in shipyards, factories, and construction, they were among those struck down in the blast. Estimates vary, but research suggests they may have made up a substantial share of immediate victims, some sources indicating roughly 1 in 5. Their presence was undeniable, yet their memory was neglected for decades. This omission was not simply an oversight. It was shaped by politics and by history itself. Japan's formal occupation of Korea had only ended with Tokyo's defeat in 1945. To admit Korean suffering in Hiroshima was to admit the forced nature of their presence, to acknowledge they were coerced laborers, taken from their homes and pressed into supporting Japan's war machine. For American accounts, acknowledging Koreans or other outsiders risked complicating the narrative that described Hiroshima purely as a military strike against an enemy population. The omission of these voices narrowed Hiroshima's story, erasing those caught between empire and war. For Korean survivors, the erasure was compounded by what followed. In Japan, they endured a double stigma, marked as Hibakusha, feared for supposedly inheritable health risks, and treated as outsiders despite long residence. In Korea, recognition was delayed by distance, bureaucracy, and political priorities during decades of division. The result was marginalization in two countries at once. Many Koreans who carried burns or illness after the bombing received little medical support or were denied access to assistance programs long offered to Japanese survivors. It often took legal petitions and court cases, some continuing as late as the 1990s and early 2000s, before compensation or equal medical benefits became available. The BBC and other accounts describe survivors who returned to Korea carrying deep scars but little recognition. In Hapshin, a rural county where many Hiroshima survivors resettled, residents struggled through illness without specialized medical care. The area became known as Korea's Hiroshima because of the concentration of survivors living with the bomb's legacy, but largely ignored by national governments. Oral histories collected from descendants describe how families lived within silence and stigma, unsure whether to speak of the past because acknowledgement could mean renewed prejudice. These details show how trauma was transmitted less by physical scars than by social exclusion. Other non-Japanese groups share in this hidden chapter. Records and later scholarship identified Chinese prisoners of war who were in Hiroshima at the time of the blast, captured in campaigns on the mainland and transported to Japan as forced labor. Some died instantly. Others lingered in makeshift wards with radiation symptoms Japanese doctors had no training to treat. For decades, their presence was omitted entirely from official accounts, their deaths categorized nowhere. Allied prisoners of war captured in battles across Southeast Asia and the Pacific were also among the victims. Their numbers were smaller, but many were killed or injured by the detonation. Survivors later carried radiation-related illness back to their home countries with little official acknowledgement, their losses eclipsed by the victory narratives of their own governments. Similar silences surrounded other Asian laborers conscripted from places such as the Philippines or Indonesia. They lived and worked in Hiroshima, scattered in projects linked to Japan's wartime industry, yet their fates were rarely recorded. Why were these stories pushed aside? Archival silences were not accidental. The politics of occupation, Cold War alliances, and the ambiguous legal status of colonial laborers all worked against acknowledgement. To admit these victims was to raise questions about Japan's imperial policies, the Allied decision to select Hiroshima, and the systems of forced labor operating across Asia. Each of these issues cut into sensitive political ground. Better, it seemed at the time, to let their records vanish. Only later activism, archival work, and testimony by families began to reconstruct this missing layer of history. Recognition came slowly, carried forward not just by survivors, but by their descendants. Associations of Korean Hibakusha in both South Korea and Japan organized memorial services, collected oral testimony, and pressed for fair treatment. One result has been the inclusion of Korean names on monuments at Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, a step that stands against decades of omission. These campaigns also demanded access to medical assistance on equal terms, noting that radiation exposure does not distinguish by nationality. In some cases, courts eventually sided with survivors, offering remedies long delayed. What emerges from these efforts is a redefinition of Hiroshima's meaning. It cannot be seen only through a Japanese lens. The bombing was an event shaped in the context of empire, with victims whose lives reached far beyond Japan's borders. Korean forced laborers, Chinese prisoners, Allied POWs, and other Asian conscripts all shared the fate of being present in one city struck by a single bomb. Their suffering connected Hiroshima to multiple nations and histories. Recognizing this complexity makes remembrance in 2025 less about a national tragedy and more about a global one. The fact that these voices remained hidden for decades alters how we think of the bombing today. Hiroshima was not a story bounded by one people or one memory, but an event inextricably tied to wider systems of power and coercion. Nationality often determined whose stories survived and whose were forgotten. Only persistent efforts, memorials, scholarship, and testimony have begun to recover fragments of what was lost. Each inclusion on a plaque or surviving recollection challenges the way history was once presented, pushing memory away from narrowed narratives of singular nations and toward the reality that catastrophe spread across borders. The bombing, then, must be remembered as more than the destruction of a Japanese city. It was also the obliteration of lives already caught in structures of labor, empire, and captivity. Their absence from earlier records is as much a measure of politics as of physical devastation. Seeing them now restores part of the human truth. Hiroshima's tragedy was, and remains, international. The silence that surrounded these victims shows how narratives of war can be shaped by what is convenient to remember and what is left unseen. And it raises another pressing question. If one city's destruction was already so contested in memory, what did it mean when another followed only 3 days later? Nagasaki, the second silence. Only 3 days after Hiroshima had been destroyed, another bomber lifted from Tinian Island carrying a second atomic weapon. The speed of that decision continues to raise difficult questions. Why strike again so soon, before the devastation in Hiroshima could even be assessed? In the urgency of August 1945, military leaders argued Japan had yet to signal surrender, and preparations for a second bomb had already been made. But the strike was not a mere repetition. The new weapon, nicknamed Fat Man, used a completely different plutonium implosion design, more complex than Hiroshima's uranium device. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, it detonated 503 meters above Nagasaki with an estimated yield of about 21 kilotons. Operational urgency, strategic calculation, and the readiness of this second design all converged on that moment, ensuring Nagasaki became site to the world's second nuclear attack. Nagasaki was not originally the target. Kokura, an industrial city that housed critical arsenals, had been first on the mission plan. But when the crew arrived overhead, thick haze and drifting smoke from earlier conventional raids obscured the city. After 3 passes without a clear line of sight, the bomber diverted to its secondary choice. That adjustment, determined by cloud cover and lingering fumes, sealed the fate of Nagasaki. What might have been Kokura's tragedy became Nagasaki's instead. Although both cities endured atomic destruction, the outcomes differed in ways directly tied to weapon design and geography. Hiroshima's Little Boy was a gun-type uranium bomb, fairly simple in its mechanism. Nagasaki's Fat Man relied on precisely synchronized high-explosive lenses that compressed a plutonium core, a much more advanced approach. For military planners, its successful detonation proved that this design could be made operational, an important step for future arsenals. For civilians below, the difference was meaningless. In both places, entire districts vanished in seconds. By the end of 1945, research institutions like the Radiation Effects Research Foundation estimate between 60,000 and 80,000 people in Nagasaki had died, whether instantly or from injuries and radiation in the months that followed. Terrain shaped the city's survival in ways distinct from Hiroshima. While Hiroshima lay across a flat plain where the fireball expanded without resistance, Nagasaki's hills and valleys partially contained the destruction. The Urakami district, sitting at the heart of the blast basin, was overwhelmed. Blocks of homes dissolved, and the Urakami Cathedral, once the largest Catholic church in East Asia, crumbled to rubble. But neighborhoods screened by ridgelines survived with less direct damage. Terrain acted as barrier and shield, sparing certain areas even as others were annihilated. This geographical accident meant survival rates in Nagasaki differed from Hiroshima, not because the bomb was weaker, but because the city's shape absorbed and deflected the expanding fireball. Cultural aftermath also diverged in subtle ways. Both cities produced communities of Hibakusha who confronted stigma, illness, and economic exclusion. Survivors in Nagasaki, like those in Hiroshima, lived under suspicion that they carried invisible contamination, struggled to marry, or found themselves refused work. But Nagasaki's identity added another dimension. Its centuries-old Catholic community, rooted in Japan's history of religious persecution and revival, turned the city into a symbolic site of spiritual loss. The destruction of the Urakami Cathedral was remembered not only as war's devastation, but also as an assault on a community's faith. For local and international Catholics alike, Nagasaki came to embody a distinctly religious memory of nuclear war, one entangled with wider Christian history in Japan. Hiroshima, by contrast, assumed the role of secular and civic symbol on the world stage. The imbalance of memory became clear in the following decades. Hiroshima gained early recognition as the primary icon of nuclear devastation, enshrined in memorial museums and international disarmament campaigns. Nagasaki's remembrance built more gradually, often centered on smaller-scale local movements and religious voices. Over time, Nagasaki developed its own peace park and annual ceremonies, yet survivors there often expressed frustration that their testimony remained overshadowed. Today, that sense of inequity is slowly easing, as Nagasaki's Hibakusha narratives take their place beside Hiroshima's as essential witnesses to what nuclear weapons inflict on human life. Part of the diminished attention to Nagasaki came from how the story was framed in post-war explanations. Hiroshima was cast as the decisive strike that forced surrender. Nagasaki was often portrayed simply as a follow-up, necessary only because Japanese leaders had not yielded. Yet this interpretation obscures crucial facts. The plutonium bomb had been prepared in advance. The mission was scheduled regardless of surrender signals, and Japan's leadership had not even fully convened to respond to Hiroshima before Nagasaki was struck. The second use was not an afterthought. It reflected strategic planning, the readiness of the device, and a desire to demonstrate continued American resolve. For the people beneath that mushroom cloud, such reasoning held little meaning. In the Urakami Valley, families disappeared in seconds. Survivors carried bodies across slopes or watched loved ones perish days later from wounds and radiation. Children who emerged alive often grew up in households fragmented by loss, facing illnesses that could not be explained or treated. Testimonies described the silence that fell across valley neighborhoods, a silence less about sound than about the absence of entire communities. That silence carried forward for years as survivors hesitated to speak. Only later did their accounts echo those of Hiroshima's Hibakusha, pledges that no other city should endure such ruin. Taken together, the two attacks stand as the only times nuclear weapons have been used on population centers. Their differences, distinct bomb designs, unique terrains, and divergent social identities show how one event could never fully illustrate the consequences of nuclear war. Hiroshima demonstrated what a uranium device could do to a flat urban plain. Nagasaki proved that a plutonium design worked in practice and that geography shaped human survival as much as physics. Both left behind survivor communities who bore the burden of radiation-induced illness, discrimination, and memory. 80 years later, in 2025, Nagasaki's silence no longer overshadows Hiroshima's, but accompanies it. Together, they hold the weight of the nuclear era, the 2 points of reference for all later debates about weapons policy, deterrence, and human cost. They remain the only inhabited places where nuclear fire was unleashed without restraint. And while international attention has broadened to encompass both, their shared testimony points back to a persistent truth. Even as the ruins smoldered, much of what happened within those cities was swiftly locked beyond public reach. It is here that the story turns from the destruction of August 1945 to the struggle over what could be known. In the aftermath, records, photographs, and eyewitness data were collected, but most of it was restricted under military authority. What could not be silenced physically became hidden on paper. It is in those confines, and in the revelations that later escaped, that the next part of this history takes shape. Secrets Declassified. When Hiroshima lay in ruins, outside control quickly extended beyond the physical city. Occupation forces moved into the wreckage with orders not only to provide relief, but to regulate what the world could know. Photographs shot by Japanese citizens, diaries written in the first days, and hospital records detailing early cases of radiation illness were seized. Doctors who had begun recording symptoms lost their notes to investigators. Even journalists who tried to write about conditions found articles censored or removed entirely. Much of the film footage captured by U.S. survey crews was classified, locked away for years. The public image of Hiroshima became one chosen by military authorities, with a fuller visual and medical record hidden. In the late 1940s, a new institution was introduced under humanitarian language, but with a different emphasis. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by the U.S. in 1947 and later reorganized as the Radiation Effects Research Foundation in 1975, began its work in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the surface, it seemed meant to help survivors. Yet over time, Hibakusha described a different reality. The ABCC offered little in the way of treatment, while focusing heavily on physical exams, blood tests, x-rays, and questionnaires. Survivors often felt the organization emphasized research over clinical care, creating mistrust that lasted for decades. This sense of imbalance grew as patients lined up for observation and data collection, but rarely received medicine or treatment in return. Reports, carefully compiled for scientific use, moved back to American authorities and later into classified files. Hibakusha themselves were mostly denied access to the findings that described their bodies in charts and graphs. Many came to view the institution less as a place to heal than as a place where their suffering was converted into statistics. This tension left a scar in memory, being studied without feeling cared for. The secrecy stretched beyond the clinic. Government memoranda, staff notes, and wartime deliberations on whether and how to use atomic weapons were sealed in classified archives. For decades, historians and the public worked with limited official statements that justified the bombings as decisive and unavoidable. Absent from the public record were discussions inside wartime councils about Japan's actual state by mid-1945. The possibility of offering surrender conditions or plans for demonstrations of atomic power rather than direct strikes. Such conversations remained closed, leaving the dominant story focused on necessity. It was not until the declassification process in the 1970s that large collections began to surface. Researchers paging through these files discovered that military officers had voiced doubts about the attack's necessity. Some argued Japan's defeat was already imminent. Others suggested staging a demonstration on an offshore site to warn of the bomb's force without killing a city. Notes of meetings revealed alternatives had been considered before dismissal. The release of this material reframed the event as a controversial decision rather than an inevitability. Declassification became a turning point, shifting the study of Hiroshima from confirming official accounts to questioning them. Medical evidence carried the same weight when it surfaced. Files contained detailed cases of radiation illness, names, onset of symptoms, and long trajectories of leukemia, thyroid cancers, and other conditions. For survivors, these documents mattered because they aligned with testimonies they had shared for decades, often doubted without official proof. Numbers that had been locked away, lists of children who developed leukemia, statistics on tumor incidents, offered external confirmation that the bomb's impact had been protracted and deadly beyond initial estimates. Images too returned, transformed by their absence. Japanese photographers like Yoshito Matsushige had risked their lives to capture the aftermath. Their images showed burned streets, patients with wounds from radiation, and families searching in ruins. Many of these photographs were taken into custody by occupying forces and hidden in U.S. collections. When they resurfaced years later, they gave the world a direct view that had been missing: the human disaster rather than abstract destruction. Together with film reels long suppressed, these photographs forced audiences to rethink Hiroshima as not only military history, but human catastrophe. The release of once secret material did more than expand historical knowledge. It reshaped remembrance. What had been told as victory now appeared as a choice made amid debated alternatives. Survivors' accounts, once met with skepticism, were now grounded in institutional data. International debates about nuclear weapons drew directly on these findings, noting that governments had gathered extensive knowledge of radiation's effects yet withheld it from the public for decades. Even photographs, no longer confined to archives, became central artifacts in exhibitions, conferences, and school textbooks worldwide. Historians today approach Hiroshima not just as an event of warfare, but as an episode mediated by decades of secrecy. Archival gaps are not seen as accidents, but as part of policy. While some interpretations of the motives differ, whether to preserve morale, to protect nuclear strategy, or simply to maintain control, the underlying fact is firm. Knowledge was restricted and only later released. What could not be spoken by survivors without official data is now acknowledged across scholarship, supported by the very files once kept hidden. The frame of analysis has altered dramatically. Declassified reports showed that the bombing was not accepted as inevitable among military planners, and that the casualty reach was deliberately studied long before the public was informed. They confirmed the survivors' experiences of lingering illness and captured, through confiscated images, the scale of suffering no press release had described. With access to this material, the historical conversation has shifted from inevitability to contingency, from sanitized images to unfiltered testimony. The slow appearance of these archives shows that Hiroshima's story was shaped both by destruction on the ground and by decisions over what information would be released. Each disclosure, whether a meeting transcript, a medical chart, or a photograph, has widened the circle of recognition. Survivors who endured skepticism could point to documentary validation. Scholars began to write with evidence that gave nuance, complication, and sometimes contradiction to the simplified narratives that had endured. The record now accepted is not a single line, but layers that reveal choices, consequences, and withheld truths. What surfaced from secrecy ensures that Hiroshima cannot be reduced to a moment of fire in 1945. It became part of a longer record of concealment and revelation. Understanding the disaster, therefore, means not only acknowledging what was burned, but also what was kept silent until much later. The city's legacy exists in documents, photos, and medical studies once hidden, which together provide a second history that operated in parallel to survivors' memories. That history leads outward from people and policy. Evidence once buried has clarified how much was lost, but it has also raised another dimension of damage, one that unfolded quietly, beyond human bodies and testimonies. The physical environment itself carried marks of the blast, retaining a record that outlasted both secrecy and archives. The environment remembers. When the atomic bomb struck Hiroshima, it was not only human lives that were extinguished. The landscape itself absorbed the blow. The detonation ignited trees where they stood, shriveled plants without flame reaching them, and left soil stripped of the nutrients needed to sustain growth. Ash drifted back to Earth mixed with radioactive matter, settling into rivers and fields. Within hours, survivors recalled tarry black rain falling from a cloud, soaking skin, rooftops, and soils. This rain darkened water supplies, poisoned fish, and in some cases caused burns on those it touched. What followed was a silence of nature, where scorched riverbanks and barren soil spoke of an ecological crisis as stark as the human one. Radiation spread invisibly across every part of the surrounding environment. Aquatic systems bore some of the first visible evidence. Fish floated dead to the surface of rivers and ponds. Farmers who tried to cultivate fields nearest the hypocenter later found growth slow or patchy, their crops weakened by contamination. Insects were reported absent in central blast areas for days afterward. Domestic animals roamed wounded or collapsed from burns and shock. What the blast did to a city of people, it likewise did to the web of life, erasing, muting, and leaving traces not immediately visible, but lodged in soil, sediment, and water. Signs of resilience appeared quickly, feeding another narrative. Within months, residents noticed plants re-emerging from fractured ground, shoots of grass threading through rubble, and trees that had appeared destroyed sprouting new growth. By the following spring, a canopy of green returned in patches that astonished those who had assumed nature would remain lifeless for years. This miracle of renewal became part of Hiroshima's story, though what sprang to the eye did not fully reveal what still lingered unseen. Beneath layers of dirt and riverbeds, radioactive residues remained measurable. Later scientific surveys documented this persistence. Soil analysis in the decades after the war found isotopes, such as cesium and strontium embedded in local sediments. These traces could not be observed with the eye, but were detectable through laboratory instruments, sometimes decades later. In certain places, along rivers, cores revealed distinctive fallout layers that could be identified by their chemical signature, separating 1945's deposit from the rest of natural history. Farmers' accounts of weaker harvests in the late 1940s found some echo in these soil studies, which supported claims of briefly reduced fertility near the center. In this way, the Earth itself preserved a chemical memory, even after fields again seemed healthy to casual view. These patterns fit into a larger understanding of how sudden releases of radiation affect ecosystems. The immediate shock killed plants and animals, while fallout carried particles into watercourses and soils. Ecologists studying Hiroshima later described the city as an early case study of ecological stress after a radiation event. Unlike nuclear testing grounds that followed, Hiroshima bore the additional complexity of being a populated river basin, where environmental contamination immediately overlapped with human survival. Birds, fish, and farm animals did not leave testimonies, but their absence was noted. Accounts described stretches of burned hillside with no insect noise or river mouths where catches stopped abruptly. Some laboratory studies of flora and fauna in post-war Japan attempted to examine whether exposure had lasting genetic effects. Results showed stress responses and abnormalities in particular populations, but much of the evidence pointed more to localized damage than to sweeping, permanent transformations. Scientists cautious about interpretation concluded that Hiroshima's environment showed acute damage and later measurable contamination, but resilience of life allowed regrowth, even as hidden residues remained detectable. Even more subtle were impacts on microorganisms and soil systems. Later examinations suggested shifts in microbial communities where radioactive materials had settled, though to outside view these changes were invisible. What appeared as smooth recovery on the surface was, in reality, an altered equilibrium underneath, a rearrangement of the smallest units that support ecological health. As the city rebuilt, its rivers were dredged, soil was tilled and replanted, and parks and peace memorial groves were established. To visitors, Hiroshima gradually appeared whole again. Yet scientists who sampled river mud or analyzed plant tissues continued to detect traces connected to the detonation. These traces did not threaten the city's ongoing life in the same way as they had in 1945, but for researchers, their persistence offered a record not written in archives or diaries. The natural environment itself bore the imprint of the bomb, invisible to casual eyes, but legible in scientific testing. This environmental knowledge carried importance far beyond Hiroshima. Later nuclear incidents, from atom bomb tests in the Pacific to accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima, were partly understood through methods refined first on Japanese soil. Hiroshima was both tragedy and precedent, an unintentional experiment that taught scientists how radiation enters and moves through earth, water, and living tissue. That uneasy legacy has shaped global protocols for measuring contamination, predicting recovery, and safeguarding communities after radiation exposure. For the people who lived with it, the ecological story folded into everyday routines. Survivors spoke of barren fields in the late 1940s, or of catching fewer fish along familiar river bends. Others remembered distorted blossoms or weakened leaves among plants that otherwise regrew. These remembered details were part of daily survival, but also reminders that nature itself had not come through unscathed. Farmers sowed seeds among particles of contamination, while families fished along waters that had carried fallout with their flow. Just as radiation left questions inside human bodies, it left questions in the ground and waters that sustained them. By the beginning of the 21st century, researchers returned with refined methods. Geologists traced fallout layers and sediments. Biologists examined plants and soils for chemical signatures. And environmental historians pointed to Hiroshima as part of a long record of human industrial impact on ecosystems. In each case, The evidence suggested not dramatic mutations or ecological collapse, but a record of contamination and stress that persisted in measurable ways long after the surface looked healed. This makes Hiroshima's environment more than background. It stands as a witness, carrying data locked into soils, sediments, and waterways. Survivors' voices told of illness and stigma. Documents reconstructed the politics of the bomb, but the environment preserved another version. One scientists continue to consult today. Its testimony is not vocal, but chemical and biological. It confirms that the destruction of August 1945 extended outward into non-human life, and that traces remain even when memory fades. The recovery of Hiroshima's green spaces has prompted awe for decades. Yet behind the parks and rivers lies an enduring environmental record of fallout, layered alongside human history. The bomb scarred people, but it also marked the land they depended on. That land still holds the record where censored files or fading memories may not. The environment remembered what happened, and scientists continue to read that memory as evidence 80 years later. And while nature has carried this quiet archive, another sort of record continued within families, the lives of children who survived, and the generations that grew beneath the shadow of the mushroom cloud. Generations in the shadow. In the households that endured after the bomb, children grew up among ruins and silence. They had not lived through the flash at 8:15, but their lives were shaped by it all the same. Some lost parents and siblings in an instant. Others carried burned scars across their skin. Many faced illnesses whose origins remained uncertain for decades. As they grew older and began raising families of their own, a new question appeared. What did it mean to be the child of a Hibakusha? These children became known as the second generation. Though they had not seen the fireball or walked through ash-choked streets, they inherited its shadow in unexpected ways. Suspicion followed them in schools, where peers whispered about mysterious illnesses they might carry. Marriage prospects often collapsed once a family background became known. The quiet fear was that radiation could be passed like inheritance, illness, deformity, or shortened lives lurking in their blood. Even when unspoken, such fears ended relationships, hardened gossip into barriers, and marked out second-generation children as different before they had ever fallen ill. The stigma was crushing. Employers sometimes avoided hiring children of Hibakusha, assuming they might later sicken and miss work. Families repeatedly described marriage negotiations that stopped suddenly once survivor status was revealed. One second-generation woman recalled being told by a potential in-law, "We cannot risk a future of sick grandchildren." Another described classmates calling her Hibakusha's child, as though it were a curse. These stories multiply into a clear pattern. The children bore not radiation's measurable health damage, but society's heavy suspicion of it. Silence within the home deepened the weight. Many survivors chose not to describe their suffering to their children, hoping to protect them. Yet the unspoken truth left gaps filled with anxiety. Children discovered medical charts tucked into drawers or scars that went unexplained. At the dinner table, the subject was often avoided altogether, reinforcing the sense that something terrible hung over their families but could not be named. This silence created its own wound, an inherited trauma, transmitted not through DNA, but through secrecy and fear. Scientific research entered this unsettled space in an effort to answer the questions stigma would not release. Beginning in the late 1940s, long-term studies tracked tens of thousands of Hibakusha and their children. By the 1950s and 1960s, results began to show that children conceived after the bombing were not experiencing broad waves of genetic deformities. Rates of malformation among them fell within the normal range of the wider Japanese population. Large-scale investigations that continued into the 1980s and beyond reaffirmed this finding. Later conceived children did not show significant increases in birth defects or inherited illness. But there was an important exception. Radiation exposure in utero, especially during the most sensitive weeks of pregnancy, and within about 1 kilometer of a hypocenter, brought devastating consequences. Mothers who had been pregnant at the time gave birth to children with microcephaly, intellectual disabilities, and other developmental impairments. These heartbreaking cases were well documented in medical records and never in dispute. The risk was not in the children conceived afterward, but in those who had already been developing during the blast and who carried direct prenatal exposure. That distinction between in utero effects and later conceived generations only sharpened the cruelty of stigma, since prejudice against second-generation children ignored what research had consistently shown. Despite the scientific reassurance, suspicion and discrimination lingered. As late as the 1970s and 80s, second-generation Hibakusha recalled difficulty finding spouses, resistance at workplaces, and a sense of being mistrusted in their own neighborhoods. In some cases, even relatives of survivors discouraged marriage within Hibakusha families, fearing reputational harm or hidden risks to grandchildren. These judgments extended the bomb's reach far past the event itself, shaping lives through social exclusion long after radiation's physical effects had faded. Government recognition added another layer. In 1957, Japan passed the Atomic Bomb Survivors Medical Care Law, providing free health services to certified Hibakusha. Survivor certificates gave access to checkups and treatment, but they also reinforced a marker of difference. While the program alleviated medical burdens, carrying the official certificate also revealed survivor status, sometimes exposing families to stigma they had tried to hide. The very policy that offered health protections could, in daily life, complicate marriage or employment by confirming what many families might otherwise have concealed. For second-generation survivors, the greater inheritance was therefore social, not biological. They grew up healthy yet treated as if broken, bearing testimony not of genes, but of suspicion. Some internalized those judgments, questioning their own worth or fearing they might, unknowingly, pass on some hidden damage. Others began to resist, insisting on their ordinariness. But the shadow of doubt persisted in whispers and bureaucratic labels alike. By the 1990s and 2000s, a generational shift began to take hold. The grandchildren of survivors, those born half a century or more after the blast, entered adulthood in a different environment. The silence their grandparents had kept and the stigma their parents faced gave way to activism. In schools, public forums, and international conferences, third-generation descendants began telling their family stories openly. Their message was rarely about illness. It was about duty, to preserve memory now that the first generation was aging, and to prevent nuclear catastrophe from recurring. In Hiroshima today, it is often the younger descendants who coordinate peace education programs, record testimonies, or travel abroad to speak with students in other countries. They may not carry scars or face the discrimination their parents did, but their identities remain marked by what happened 80 years ago. For them, inheritance has become responsibility. They see themselves as custodians of memory, a bridge between elderly Hibakusha and future generations who will know the bomb only through stories, documents, and acts of remembrance. This transformation reflects how the shadow of the bomb has stretched across time. In the first generation, it appeared as burns and sickness. In the second, it was stigma and silence. In the third, it has become a commitment to speak and educate. The burden has shifted form, but never disappeared. Instead, it has embedded itself into family histories, shaping identity and action across generations. Hiroshima today is remembered not only in archives and ruins, but also through these voices of descendants. Their presence ensures the memory of the bomb is not relegated to elderly survivors alone. It lives in classrooms, peace ceremonies, and international movements that connect family history to global issues of war, weapons, and human survival. As the world approaches the fading of the Hibakusha generation, these younger inheritors carry both memory and mission, reshaping identity from burden into active testimony. And yet, their voices are not separate from the city around them. The families who bore these shadows lived among ruins that slowly transformed into a rebuilt Hiroshima. Their activism and memory work grew alongside a city that itself chose to remember in stone, parks, and annual rites. The next part of the story turns to that physical and civic transformation, how a place reduced to ashes became a living monument to peace. From ruin to peace memorial. Out of Hiroshima's ruins, rebuilding began almost immediately. Survival meant clearing rubble, constructing temporary housing, and reopening tram lines so the city could function again. But alongside the practical work rose a harder question. How should the devastation itself be remembered? For many residents in those early years, the instinct was to remove reminders and return to ordinary life. Yet within the flattened city, one building remained as a fragment of the past, the skeletal frame of the Industrial Promotion Hall. To some, it was a scar that should be demolished. To others, it demanded preservation as a witness. That difference set the stage for a long argument over whether Hiroshima's memory would be erased or preserved as part of its identity. The ruin became known as the A-BombDome or Genbaku Dome. During the late 1940s and 1950s, city planners debated tearing it down, hoping to clear space for reconstruction. Residents argued both sides, some saying its presence prevented the city from moving forward, others insisting its destruction would mean forgetting what happened. Over time, survivors and peace activists gained ground, pressing for the dome to remain intact as a permanent reminder. In 1996, after decades of activism and protection, the dome was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though not without debate, since both Japan and other nations had to confront what it symbolized. Its preservation, however contested, set the tone for Hiroshima's emergence as a peace city. The next step was more deliberate. Instead of leaving only fragments, the city decided to create a designated space where commemoration, education, and activism could take root. In the early 1950s, plans were drawn up for Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. Its layout balanced open ground, tree-lined paths, and carefully designed monuments. At its center, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum opened in 1955, giving form to the mission of remembrance. Inside its galleries, charred school uniforms, melted roof tiles, and testimonials from survivors centered the memory of human lives, not abstract destruction. From its outset, the museum stood as both evidence of what had occurred and as a warning to future generations. Public ritual emerged alongside physical monuments. On August 6, 1947, Hiroshima held its first official memorial ceremony, beginning a tradition that remains core to the city's identity. Each year since, at precisely 8:15 a.m., the moment the bomb detonated, the peace bell tolls and the city observes a minute of silence. As lanterns float down rivers at night, survivors, families, and visitors reflect on lives lost. Over time, representatives from foreign governments began attending, affirming that Hiroshima's loss belonged to world memory as much as local memory. By 2025, ceremonies not only serve mourners in the park, but are broadcast globally, reinforcing Hiroshima's role as an enduring site of international reflection. The politics of remembrance shaped what forms these memorials would take. In the years of American occupation, open criticism of the bombings was not encouraged, and Japanese officials debated how to frame the event without clashing with broader post-war narratives. Should the focus remain on civilian suffering alone, or should memory extend to questions of Japan's militarism and responsibility? Should Hiroshima be rebuilt as any other Japanese city, or as an international voice against nuclear war? The existence of the dome and the construction of the Peace Park symbolized choices made in favor of memory, but each decision came with tension. Only sustained pressure from Hibakusha, activists, and international peace movements pushed the balance toward Hiroshima's identification as a peace city. By the late 20th century, Hiroshima's civic identity had matured into this role. Thousands of school children visited the Peace Museum each year, meeting survivors who described what it meant to grow up scarred or to watch loved ones die from radiation. The A-BombDome stood untouched in the center of a thriving modern city, forcing passers-by to confront both recovery and destruction in the same streets. Exhibits expanded to cover both the science of radiation effects and the culture of Hibakusha testimony. making the museum a reference point not only for visitors, but for scholars, policymakers, and disarmament advocates worldwide. As Hiroshima rebuilt itself physically, the city also turned outward. Peace Memorial Park became the backdrop for international events and negotiations, while conferences and symposia used the museum's halls to discuss nuclear disarmament. Youth groups built exchange programs that brought students from abroad, ensuring the story of 1945 was not confined to textbooks or survivor memoirs, but experienced directly in Hiroshima itself. These efforts condensed into a broader transformation. What began as local mourning gradually became international. Advocacy. By 2025, Hiroshima functions as an educational and political hub where peace education programs run year-round, trainings for teachers are offered, and digital archives preserve survivor testimony in perpetuity. The balance between ruin and living city remains visible. Office buildings rise around the dome, trams pass through Peace Memorial Park, and tourists walk between memorial sites. Each August 6th, Hiroshima becomes both a city going about its daily life and the stage for a global moment of silence. That duality, modern recovery and preserved ruin, ordinary life and extraordinary memory, defines what Hiroshima has become. Landmarks and rituals now give structure to remembrance, but their purpose pushes beyond commemoration. The A-BombDome survival insists that destruction cannot be erased. The 1955 opening of the museum provided material evidence and testimonies to anchor education. The annual Minute of Silence at 8:15 fixes memory within a precise ritual each year. And today, recorded testimonies ensure that voices of Hibakusha extend far beyond their natural lifetimes, making the act of remembering an ongoing process rather than a fading recollection. Leaders and public figures continue to use Hiroshima as a stage for symbolic acknowledgement. Heads of state come to bow in silence, lay wreaths, or speak under the dome's shadow. Sometimes, these visits align with political summits, pairing Hiroshima's weight with pledges of future restraint or disarmament. At the same time, youth from Hiroshima travel abroad to share their city story, making Hiroshima not just a place for visitors, but a voice carried outward by its descendants. In the end, Hiroshima's built landscape tells a story intertwined with activism and education. The city chose not to erase its wounds, but to preserve them openly, turning the site of destruction into the foundation of a civic mission driven by peace. Monuments and museums within the city do not celebrate war or suffering, but serve as instruments to warn, teach, and connect. Hiroshima demonstrates through its own reconstruction that rebuilding can mean more than recovery, that it can create a communal insistence that annihilation must never be repeated. For viewers today, the memorials stand as both testimony and question. When history is kept alive through stone, ritual, and recorded voice, what responsibility lies with us who inherit it? If you visited a peace memorial, what moment or detail spoke to you most? Share your thoughts below. The act of reflecting is part of carrying memory forward. Hiroshima stands now as a city rebuilt with peace woven into its civic identity. But memory alone has not eliminated nuclear threats. The next challenge comes from outside its borders, where nuclear weapons remain in national arsenals and international rivalries continue to escalate. Even as the city insists that Hiroshima's fire should never return, the global landscape tells a more uncertain story. Nuclear shadows over 2025. Nearly 80 years after Hiroshima, the nuclear world of 2025 is defined not by retreat, but by persistence and renewal. 9 states are recognized as nuclear-armed: the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. Collectively, they hold thousands of warheads that remain central to defense policies. The Cold War's swollen arsenals have been reduced in size, yet the weapons that remain are actively maintained, modernized, and in some cases expanded. Far from fading into the past, nuclear arms remain woven into the strategies that shape great power rivalry and regional security alike. Modernization is the defining feature of this era. Nuclear powers are not just storing old warheads. They are replacing delivery systems, building new submarines, refining missiles, and adapting warheads with improved accuracy. Reports from institutions such as SIPRI in 2025 note that several states are investing heavily in next-generation platforms, with delivery systems and modernization programs creating fresh technical and strategic risks. The language of modern deterrence now dominates military doctrine, reframing weapons that leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki as tools of stability rather than warnings for disarmament. Survivors, who for decades pleaded for abolition, watch governments improve the very devices they hoped the world would abandon. Some doctrines now openly discuss potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, arms with explosive yields lower than those dropped in 1945. Officials frame these as more controllable, imagining battlefield scenarios where nuclear weapons could be employed without escalating to total war. Yet the barrier to nuclear use is not simply a question of yield. Once a detonation occurs, fallout, fire, and radiation extend far from any intended strike zone. Survivors remind the world that the language of limitation is an illusion. Every nuclear explosion devastates, beyond military parameters. The idea of a small or usable bomb obscures the fact that even modest detonations echo Hiroshima in their human consequences. This new age also carries risks linked to speed and decision-making. Delivery modernization means shorter launch times and reduced warning windows. The reduced margin for error leaves leaders minutes to assess whether a radar signal indicates a real attack or a false alarm. History already recorded how easily errors can escalate. In 1983, the Soviet early warning system misread sunlight on clouds as incoming missiles, but a single officer judged it was a false alarm and prevented escalation. In 1979, a U.S. training program loaded simulated attacks into live systems, briefly sparking panic. Each false alarm was resolved by human restraint and coincidence. In a 2025 environment where flight times shorten and arsenals diversify, the space for such correction shrinks further. These developments do not make nuclear war inevitable, but they increase the chances of miscalculation and diminish the margin for human error. Regional tensions intensify the danger. In Eastern Europe, nuclear invocations have returned to political rhetoric amid ongoing wars and alliances under strain. In South Asia, India and Pakistan maintain forward-deployed arsenals, while periodic border clashes underscore how quickly escalation could spiral. In East Asia, missile tests and military maneuvers contribute to unease across Japan and South Korea, where the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is inseparable from current fears. Meanwhile, the Middle East continues to feature uncertainty, with Israel's undeclared weapons raising questions for neighbors who weigh their own ambitions. These regional crises are not hypothetical. They place nuclear arsenals in the immediate context of disputes that could trigger action through miscalculation or provocation. Treaty frameworks that once offered restraint now show significant fractures. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted by dozens of states, represents a clear expression of international opposition to nuclear arms. Yet none of the 9 nuclear-armed states have signed it. Even Japan, despite Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has not joined, reflecting the tension between disarmament advocacy and reliance on security alliances. Other agreements have expired, lapsed without renewal, or remained unsigned by key states, leaving the global system of arms control weaker than in previous generations. Symbolic progress exists in statements of principle, but it lacks the binding participation of those states that determine whether nuclear weapons remain or disappear. This disconnect is visible in the contrast between testimony and strategy. Hibakusha speak in their 80s and 90s, standing in peace parks declaring that the existence of these weapons ensures no safety can be lasting. Meanwhile, governments invest billions into research laboratories and weapons factories to extend arsenals through this century. One vision defines peace as abolition. The other defines peace as balance through deterrence. The two have existed side by side for 80 years without resolution. The irony is profound. The first nuclear age was born silently by civilians who suffered burns, radiation sickness, and loss on an incomprehensible scale. The present nuclear age is justified in the language of strategy, technology, and deterrence, contexts that make the weapons seem abstract, removed from living communities. Yet behind this language remains the same possibility that entire neighborhoods, families, and generations could be extinguished in minutes. Accidents remain one of the least acknowledged dangers. Technical faults, cyber interference, or shifts in command readiness have triggered false alarms before. The difference in 2025 is that faster delivery systems compress decision times to dangerously narrow margins. Where an earlier generation had hours to confirm or deny a threat, today's leaders may have only minutes. That pressure increases the chance of mistakes, whether based on misread data, aggressive policy, or sheer human error. The history of nuclear near misses is a reminder that destruction may come not only from deliberate decision, but from cascading flaws in systems built to signal war. What emerges is a picture of contradiction. Arsenals smaller than Cold War peaks, but more efficient and deadly, treaties celebrated, but increasingly hollow, and Hibakusha still voicing appeals even as their numbers fade. School groups walk through Hiroshima's museum to see charred clothing, while news reports describe weapons capable of striking continents. The shadows of 1945 remain, not as relics, but as stark contrasts standing against modern laboratories and military budgets. This reality underscores why Hiroshima is invoked whenever nuclear policy re-enters headlines. Memories of a single detonation that destroyed a city become a reference point to measure contemporary risk, whether new doctrines about tactical use, stalled treaties, or the continuing expansion of arsenals. Survivors' warning has never been abstract. One bomb transformed history, and new designs only magnify the scale of possible harm. Their testimony is not nostalgia. It is a practical warning that modernization and shifting doctrines can resurrect the danger embodied in 1945. What they witnessed remains the clearest evidence of what any nuclear use brings: irreversible destruction that no strategy can control. Do you think modernization of these arsenals is compatible with the memory of Hiroshima? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps keep this debate alive where it matters, in public understanding. As the story moves forward, the question becomes larger than strategy or arsenals. The legacy of Hiroshima is not limited to battlefield choices. It is a thread woven through survival, science, memory, and warning. Hiroshima is not only a past event, but a living reminder carried forward into the present. The survivors, 99,130 still registered in 2025, bear witness not just in memory, but in the choices societies must make today. The outlines of bodies on walls and the preserved ruins show how one moment can define generations, while the voices of Hibakusha urge us to listen before they are gone. Remembering Hiroshima means listening to survivors now and using their testimony to shape policy, because the technical choices of states echo into human lives. If this moved you, leave a thought below and subscribe for more history that matters. As Hibakusha voices fade, their testimony becomes both legacy and warning, and that responsibility belongs to all of us.